For 3 weeks, the same van had been circling James's postal route, always staying just far enough back to avoid notice. But you don't spend 12 years tracking human trafficking networks without learning to spot surveillance patterns. This wasn't random. Someone was mapping his neighborhood's children, and James was the only one who'd noticed. Welcome to Secret Human Stories. Before I tell you this incredible story of hidden vigilance and community protection, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are stopped by people who learn to hunt predators professionally. James Mitchell was the perfect postal worker for the Riverside Heights neighborhood route. At 43, he'd been walking the same streets for 8 years, delivering mail with the kind of reliability that made residents set their clocks by his schedule. Every morning at 8:47 a.m., he'd arrive at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street. By 11:15, he'd be working his way through the apartment complex on Oak Avenue. By 2:30, he'd finish his route at the elementary school, just as children were being dismissed for the day. The residents of Riverside Heights knew James well. Mrs. Patterson always had a glass of iced tea waiting for him on hot summer days. Mr. Rodriguez would flag him down to discuss the local baseball team's latest trades. The kids at Oak Elementary would wave from the playground when they saw his familiar postal uniform approaching their school with the daily delivery. James had the kind of steady, unremarkable job that let him blend into the neighborhood fabric. He knew which houses had new babies, which elderly residents might need extra help getting their mail, and which families were going through tough times. He was part of the community's daily rhythm, as dependable as sunrise and as invisible as air. But James Mitchell hadn't always been a postal worker, and the skills that made him excellent at noticing neighborhood changes hadn't been learned during Postal Service training. From 2003 to 2015, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell had served in Army intelligence, specializing in human intelligence gathering and counter-trafficking operations. For 12 years, he'd worked in the shadows of America's most complex military operations, not fighting conventional enemies, but hunting the predators who exploited the chaos of war zones to traffic human beings. His missions had taken him to places that don't appear on official deployment records: refugee camps where children disappeared in the night, border regions where desperate families fell prey to smuggling networks, urban centers where military contractors looked the other way while local traffickers operated with impunity. James's job had been to identify, infiltrate, and dismantle the networks that treated human beings as commodities. The work had required a specific set of skills that most soldiers never developed: pattern recognition that could spot a trafficking operation from seemingly unrelated data points, surveillance detection that could identify when predators were conducting reconnaissance, behavioral analysis that could distinguish between legitimate business activity and the careful choreography of criminal networks. James had been exceptional at this work, so exceptional that he'd been assigned to joint task forces with FBI, DEA, and international law enforcement agencies. His final assignment had been with a classified unit that operated in 17 countries, dismantling trafficking networks that moved children across international borders. In 12 years of service, his intelligence had led to 247 arrests and the rescue of over 400 victims. But that life had extracted a cost that James hadn't fully understood until he tried to return to civilian society. The constant exposure to humanity's darkest impulses, the knowledge of how predators operated, the hypervigilance required to stay alive while hunting dangerous people, it all followed him home in ways that made normal life nearly impossible. The transition had been brutal. PTSD therapy helped with the nightmares and anxiety, but it couldn't turn off the part of his mind that automatically scanned every environment for threats, analyzed every person's behavioral patterns, and flagged anomalies that might indicate predatory activity. James had tried office jobs, retail work, even attempted to use his military experience in corporate security, but civilian life felt impossibly naive and vulnerable. Then he discovered the Postal Service. The work was outdoors, solitary, and structured. More importantly, it gave him a legitimate reason to move through residential neighborhoods, observing patterns and maintaining situational awareness without seeming paranoid or threatening. For 8 years, it had been the perfect balance between using his protective instincts and living a normal life, until 3 weeks ago, when his two worlds collided in the most dangerous way possible. The white cargo van first appeared on a Tuesday morning during James's second week of March deliveries. Nothing immediately suspicious about it, White cargo vans were common in residential neighborhoods, used by contractors, delivery services, and maintenance crews. But James noticed it because noticing vehicles was part of his ingrained surveillance awareness. The van was parked on Elm Street, positioned with clear sightlines to Oak Elementary School's main entrance. The driver appeared to be checking his phone, but James observed him for several minutes and noticed something troubling. The man's attention kept drifting to the school's dismissal procedures, not to his phone screen. On Wednesday, the same van appeared on Birch Avenue, this time positioned to observe the bus stop where 12 children waited for their ride to middle school. Same driver, same behavior pattern of pretending to be occupied while actually conducting surveillance of children's routines. By Thursday, James was actively tracking the van's movements while maintaining his postal duties. The vehicle appeared at different locations along his route, always positioned to observe children's activities, school entrances, playground areas, bus stops, the community center where kids attended after-school programs. The driver was systematic, methodical, and careful to avoid staying in any single location long enough to attract attention. These weren't the behaviors of a lost tourist or a distracted contractor. This was reconnaissance, and James recognized it, because he'd conducted similar surveillance operations against trafficking networks in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and along the Mexican border. Someone was mapping the children in his neighborhood, documenting their schedules, identifying vulnerable targets. On Friday, James made the decision that would change everything. Instead of simply observing, he began his own counter-surveillance operation. Using techniques learned from 12 years of intelligence work, James started documenting the van's patterns while maintaining his postal duties. He memorized the license plate, noted the timing of appearances, and began building a behavioral profile of the suspect. More troubling, he started recognizing the tactical sophistication of the surveillance. This wasn't some random opportunist, but someone with training and experience in reconnaissance techniques. The van driver was conducting what intelligence professionals call area familiarization, systematically mapping a target environment to identify opportunities and vulnerabilities. In military contexts, this kind of surveillance preceded planned operations. In civilian contexts, especially when focused on children, it suggested something far more sinister. James's worst suspicions were confirmed when he noticed the driver photographing not just children, but also the adults responsible for supervising them. School crossing guards, bus drivers, playground monitors, after-school program coordinators. The man was mapping the entire child protection network in the neighborhood, identifying who might intervene if something happened. By the second week, James had gathered enough intelligence to understand the scope of the threat. The van appeared on schedule during every phase of children's daily routines: morning school arrivals, afternoon dismissals, weekend playground activities, evening sports practices. The driver had developed detailed knowledge of when children were most accessible and least supervised. But James also noticed something else. He was the only adult who'd identified the pattern. The driver had become so familiar that parents, teachers, and even local police officers no longer registered his presence as unusual. The perfect camouflage for predatory reconnaissance. This was exactly how trafficking networks operated in conflict zones: patient, systematic surveillance that mapped target populations while becoming invisible through familiarity. James had disrupted these operations before, but always with the full resources of military intelligence units. This time, he was a postal worker with no official authority and no backup team. On Monday of the third week, the situation escalated. James observed the van driver conducting close-range surveillance of individual children, photographing specific kids during playground activities, and noting which ones appeared to have less adult supervision. The reconnaissance phase was ending. Operational planning was beginning. James knew from his intelligence experience that trafficking networks typically moved from surveillance to action within days of completing their reconnaissance. If this followed the patterns he'd seen overseas, the window for intervention was closing rapidly. That evening, James made the most difficult decision of his civilian life. He activated protocols he'd hoped never to use again, contacting former colleagues who could verify his intelligence and coordinate an appropriate response. The postal worker who'd been trying to live a quiet life realized that some duties never end, some skills are too important to abandon, and some threats require people willing to step out of their peaceful lives to protect the innocent. The call went to Special Agent Maria Santos at the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. Agent Santos, this is Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, Army Intelligence retired. I have actionable intelligence on a suspected child trafficking reconnaissance operation, and I need immediate support. Agent Santos knew James's reputation from their joint operations in Eastern Europe. When James Mitchell called with trafficking intelligence, you listened. Within hours, a federal task force was coordinating with local law enforcement to investigate the threat James had identified. The surveillance confirmation came quickly. FBI agents conducting their own observation of the white van documented the same patterns James had recorded: systematic reconnaissance of children's activities, photographing of supervisory personnel, and behavioral indicators consistent with trafficking network operations. The van's registered owner had connections to known trafficking organizations operating in 3 states. But the federal response also revealed something that made James's intervention even more critical. This wasn't an isolated operation. The surveillance patterns he'd detected in Riverside Heights were part of a larger network conducting similar reconnaissance in 12 communities across the region. His postal route had become ground zero for a trafficking operation that could have affected hundreds of children. The arrest operation was planned for Wednesday morning, timed to coincide with the van's scheduled appearance at Oak Elementary School. James continued his normal postal duties, but now he was coordinating with federal agents positioned throughout the neighborhood. His daily mail delivery became cover for the final phase of a counter-trafficking operation. At 11:43 a.m., as James approached the mailbox outside Oak Elementary, the white van arrived on schedule. The driver began his usual surveillance routine, unaware that his weeks of reconnaissance had been detected and documented by someone trained to recognize exactly what he was doing. The arrest was swift and professional. FBI agents, positioned based on James's intelligence, took the suspect into custody before he could react or dispose of evidence. The van contained detailed surveillance records on 43 children, photographs of their daily routines, and planning documents for what federal prosecutors would later describe as a sophisticated child trafficking operation designed to target multiple victims simultaneously. But the most important discovery came when agents searched the suspect's residence. Evidence of an active trafficking network operating across state lines, with connections to international criminal organizations. James's vigilance hadn't just prevented a local crime, it had exposed a major trafficking operation that federal authorities had been trying to identify for over 2 years. The investigation that followed dismantled a network responsible for trafficking dozens of children across multiple states. 14 additional arrests were made, safe houses were raided, and victims were recovered and provided with support services. The case became one of the FBI's most significant trafficking investigations of the year. Throughout the entire operation, James Mitchell's role remained largely invisible. Federal authorities credited community vigilance and cooperation for the breakthrough, but never identified the specific individual whose intelligence had made the investigation possible. James requested that his involvement remain classified, preferring to return to his anonymous life as a neighborhood postal worker, but his community began noticing subtle changes in their postal service. James seemed more engaged, more observant of neighborhood dynamics. Parents started receiving informal security advice about child safety. Local law enforcement began getting more detailed reports about suspicious activities. The man delivering their mail had become an unofficial guardian, applying 12 years of anti-trafficking experience to protect their children. Mrs. Patterson noticed it first. James always seemed to care about our neighborhood, but lately, he's been different, more protective, more aware of what's happening with our kids. She was right, though she didn't know why. James had stopped trying to suppress his protective instincts and started using them in service of his community. The changes were subtle but significant. James began timing his route to coincide with children's most vulnerable moments, walking to school alone, waiting at bus stops without supervision, playing in parks during off-peak hours. His presence became a deterrent factor that potential predators would have to account for in their planning. He also started building informal networks with other community protectors, crossing guards, bus drivers, school maintenance staff, playground monitors. James shared general safety awareness techniques without revealing his intelligence background, creating a more vigilant community environment that made predatory activity more difficult to conduct undetected. The Oak Elementary School principal, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, received anonymous security assessments that helped her improve child protection protocols. Local police began getting more detailed reports about suspicious activities, often with analysis that demonstrated professional-level threat assessment capabilities. The neighborhood became safer in ways that residents noticed but couldn't fully explain. 6 months after the trafficking network's disruption, James received a visit from Agent Santos. "James, we need to discuss your future involvement in community protection efforts. Your skills are too valuable to remain completely unofficial." The conversation that followed led to James joining a classified program that placed former intelligence specialists in civilian roles where they could serve as early warning systems for trafficking activity. The Postal Service, with its comprehensive neighborhood access and routine contact with residential communities, had become an ideal platform for this kind of protective intelligence work. James was offered training updates, communication protocols with federal authorities, and resources for identifying and reporting trafficking indicators. The program operated in 47 cities, staffed by retired military intelligence professionals who had transitioned to civilian careers that provided community access: postal workers, delivery drivers, maintenance personnel, public service employees. The goal was simple: create an invisible network of professionally trained observers who could identify predatory activity before it reached operational levels. James's successful intervention in Riverside Heights had proven the concept's effectiveness and led to its national expansion. But for James, the most important outcome was personal. He'd found a way to use his protective instincts and professional skills without returning to the psychological costs of active military service. Protecting children in his own community felt different from hunting traffickers in foreign countries. It was healing instead of haunting, constructive instead of destructive. Today, James Mitchell still walks his postal route through Riverside Heights every morning. He still arrives at Maple and 3rd Street at 8:47 a.m., still finishes at Oak Elementary at 2:30 p.m. Mrs. Patterson still offers iced tea on hot days, and Mr. Rodriguez still wants to discuss baseball trades. But the children in Riverside Heights are safer because their postal worker spent 12 years learning to identify the people who prey on children, and he never stopped watching for them. The mail carrier who delivers their letters is also the intelligence professional who ensures that predators can't operate undetected in their neighborhood. James's story teaches us something important about community safety. The most effective protection comes not from obvious security measures, but from invisible vigilance by people who understand how predators operate. The trafficking network that targeted Riverside Heights was stopped not by police patrols or security cameras, but by someone who recognized predatory patterns because he'd spent 12 years learning to disrupt them professionally. The greatest protectors don't wear uniforms or carry weapons. Sometimes they wear postal uniforms and carry mail bags. Sometimes they notice things that others miss, and sometimes that vigilance saves children who never know they were in danger. The postal worker who knew too much about human trafficking became the postal worker who knew exactly enough to keep predators away from his community's children. And in neighborhoods across America, similar stories are playing out every day as former military and intelligence professionals use their skills to protect the innocent in ways that will never make headlines, but make all the difference in the world. James Mitchell clocks out every afternoon at 4:15, just like every other postal worker. But unlike every other postal worker, he spends his evening hours updating threat assessments, communicating with federal task forces, and preparing for dangers that he hopes will never come. Because some skills are too important to retire, some threats require professional-level vigilance, and some communities deserve protection from people who know exactly what they're protecting them from. The postal worker's protective instinct became a community's invisible shield, and 43 children in Riverside Heights grow up a little safer because someone who learned to hunt predators professionally never stopped watching for them, even after the uniform came off and the official mission ended.